reviews have called this latest book in-depth and insightful, and I think one even said that it had too much history and
too many words and too much history. So too much knowledge and history in my books. I'm sorry.
Okay, well here
that was my favorite review. I loved it. So that was like an online review. Yeah, that was one of my favorites. I was like, it was like, does it have too many words? Maybe. Does it have too much information? Possibly. I was like, yes, it's weird what I do with my books. That's strange.
Well, here at the American Writers Museum, I think that's a ringing endorsement.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not enough songs. Not enough songs in my book. Next time we will do that.
Yeah. We could hum something right now.
I was gonna do like, I can't hum the theme song. Do 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 do.
Yeah. Let's not do that.
Good.
So I wanted to start by when you and I were talking about this book while you were writing it. Jennifer and I used to work together a certain number of years ago, and I won't disclose how many years ago because that would be telling. And when she first talked about writing this book, I said, how do you assess the impact of something like this when the impact is all around us? So when you take us back to when the show first aired, sort of what was the sort of cultural ecosystem that existed at that time?
Yeah, it's really important to always talk about that with any of my books. I have to like time travel, which is kind of fun. You have to kind of go back and say like, this is just not what we were doing then. I mean, it actually takes us back kind of to my last book, which Seinfeld, the finale aired the same year that Sex and the City premiered, literally weeks before. So that tells you kind of like, that was what we were doing. And Friends was sort of at its heights then. And Friends is an interesting comparison because it too, at the time, I swear this is really true, like at the time, it too was sort of groundbreaking in the sense of like, we hadn't had a lot of shows about single people. This was about single people in the city. And they did talk a lot about sex on that show. For what we were used to, they were pretty forward thinking, and there were times when, in fact, they kind of like hit the network censors, like they couldn't show a condom wrapper on NBC.
Horror.
Yeah, well, and they were always mad because Seinfeld got to do whatever. Seinfeld was like the older brother who got to do whatever he wanted. Like Seinfeld got to have a whole masturbation episode. And then Friends couldn't actually show, safe sex. So that was kind of, if you think about, I feel like that's a really good indicator because these are the shows that were happening that were about, Seinfeld and Friends were the shows about single people in New York City. That's where they were coming from. So you can see how mind-blowing something like Sex and the City is in that context. Though they didn't really conceive it, you never conceive a TV show thinking like, we will now be groundbreaking. You think like, gosh, I hope we get a couple episodes, or like, it would be amazing if we got a season 2. Like that's sort of how TV works. So they weren't setting out necessarily to do all of this, but it was a pretty big deal. It was very different from what we had seen.
So how did Sex and the City then change that ecosystem? What are the effects that you've seen in the years since the show went off the air?
I always say, I feel like Sex and the City is sort of underrated in terms of its effect because it actually started before The Sopranos. And The Sopranos was like about a middle-aged white guy with problems, and it was about killing people. So everyone thought it was brilliant immediately. Sex and the City was fun to watch, and it was about women. So therefore, it's continued to be widely dismissed. But I think it changed things just as much as The Sopranos. I love The Sopranos. There's no offense to The Sopranos, but it's an interesting comparison. Sex and the City really pushed us into this era now that we're in of like these comedies that are what they call single camera. So that's where it looks like a movie instead of the live in front of a studio audience setup that like Friends and Seinfeld had. So they really pushed us into that era, and they also really did this thing where they mixed, as they went on, they mixed comedy and drama really seamlessly. I mean, there's an episode, one of my favorites, when Miranda's mother dies, Right, it's incredible. I mean, it's like this is one of these where I always say, like, you get a bunch of women together and they start talking about this one, and they're like, and then she's behind the coffin and she's single, but then Carrie runs up and like it's a whole thing. But it's incredible. It's really dramatic. And Cynthia Nixon acts her ass off as always. But in that same episode, Samantha is, I don't even want to say dating, having sex regularly with a wrestling coach. And there's a bit where she's dressed in a onesie to like wrestle and then have sex with him. And her storyline doesn't even end there. There's also a bit about how, presumably because of Miranda's mother's death, she doesn't really acknowledge feelings about it, but she loses her orgasm. And there's a time when Charlotte calls her on the phone, and she answers and she says, "Charlotte, I told you I'd be masturbating all day. What do you want?" It is extraordinary that a show could do that many things in 1.5 hour. Like, and it doesn't feel weird. Some of the early episodes are a little weird. Later, they got their shtick down. And like, I just think that's why that's among my favorite episodes, because that just shows how, and we've seen a lot of shows since kind of picking up parts of this, at least. Even something like The Office does, this incredible thing where you can all of a sudden find yourself crying at an episode of The Office, even though Michael Scott is an idiot. He was also really touching, right? And a lot of shows do this now, and it seems normal, but it wasn't what everybody was doing at the time. And we're leaving out all of the impact that this had on women on television and sex on television, which is like huge also.
Well, tell us a little bit about that.
Okay.
So in terms of, both in terms of what was depicted and also how audiences responded to it.
Yeah, I mean, this stuff, the women and sex are kind of intertwined. Like, they can be seen as separate to some extent, but they're really intertwined because, in the book, I talk a lot about the early reviews, and they were unbelievable. Like, oh my, people were so angry at the show. The male reviewers, for the most part, were so upset. It's sort of one of those things where when you look at it now and read them over, you're sort of embarrassed for them because it's so obvious what's going on. You're like, oh, honey, I see. You were scared. I know, it was really scary how the ladies were like, talking about how a man was not as well endowed as they'd like. And
imagine.
A lot of these reviews were like hand-wringing over, like, I'm not even kidding. Some of them, even written by women, were like, and I just can't imagine how men must feel watching this. I mean, they're objectified. And, oh, my heavens, they taught that a gherkin is mentioned in relation to a man's member. I just can't believe this locker room talk.
I declare, Miss Scarlett.
I declare, yes. It's so crazy. And then others, I mean, there were just a couple. Tom Shales at the Washington Post, I sort of actually actively go after him in the book a little bit. Like, I do a little call and response with some of his review. It's bizarre. Like, he'd be dragged on the internet 5 ways to Sunday now for what he said. But at the time, it just seemed he was completely entitled to, it's this very strange combination of, like, he's actively mean about Sarah Jessica Parker's looks. He talks about her scraggly hair and something about her face and I don't know, like, it's just awful. And then by the end of the review, though, he's also like, but the producers were smart enough to put a wet t-shirt contest sequence into the credits. I was like, if you can see that, the little splash, I was like, yes, she has breasts and there is a splash. That is all true. But that is not the way I would describe that credit sequence at all. So he was like disparaging her looks while sexualizing her at the same time. It was very, very strange. They were mean, and I think it's because of this women and sex, intersection. They didn't know what to make of it. So, that made a huge impact on both TV depictions and how we live our lives. I would say the TV depictions, we now have things like Broad City and Insecure, and Girls is an obvious one. But, we wouldn't like now it's just normal that there's a show, you know, Broad City had a pegging episode. I was like, huh, there's a thing we didn't do on Sex and the City. Like, we did a lot.
I'm surprised now that
I know
that didn't happen.
I guess it really wasn't quite on the menu yet for like,
so to speak.
I'm using that term because they actually use it on the show when the Tookus Lingus episode of Sex and the City it's one of my favorite discussions because they're like, and this is something that I can attest to, like in New York City, this does happen. That Carrie's like, how did they all get the memo at the same time that Tookus Lingus is now on the menu? Why are they all asking for it all of a sudden? I do love Tookus Lingus. I think it's a nicer term than rimming. I told you I was just going to go for it in this discussion.
Yeah.
So
go for it.
I looked. There's no children, and you know, I think so to go from that to like that it's completely casual and normal that Broad City would have a pegging episode. Like, you can all go home and Google these terms if you don't know what they are, because I'm not going to go that far.
Listen, when two people love each other very, very much.
There are many choices. That's the end of that sentence, is that there are many more choices than a lot of straight. This is true, though. There are many more choices than a lot of especially straight people realized, partly before Sex and the City was created by a gay man and run by a gay man. So I really truly believe that they opened up our menu to some extent to other options that straight people didn't talk about before. At least they might have been doing them, but they definitely didn't talk about them. So that's a huge, I call these Socratic dialogues that they had at brunch, like where they would kind of just like,
I couldn't help but wonder.
right, it's part of they couldn't help but wondering. And you know, one of the women would just sort of show up at brunch and be like, here is the thing I have been requested to do by some random guy this week, or here's the weird thing that this guy did, what do you all think? And then they'd all have their different discussions. That to me is huge. I mean, I think that's adult sex education. You know, and this is a little before we could just go to the internet and Google these terms. So they helped us learn a lot of this stuff and brought it out into the open more, I think, for other shows as well. And now I feel like it doesn't even seem that racy now, but it was really mind-blowing at the time. Like the anal sex episode in the first season was like the first big, it's the watershed moment, is the anal, as it was called at an event I did the other day. We were reading scenes aloud and they were like, hey, do you guys want to do the anal sex cab scene? And I was like, yes, because that is where they all discuss in the back of the cab together whether Charlotte should have anal sex or not, whether she should be Mrs. Up the Butt or not. And these are all really big things. Like the fact that we can talk about this and like laugh about it as adults, like, is cool. And that you could then go to brunch and say to your girlfriends, you didn't even have to like discuss yourself. You could just be like, what'd you think of that discussion on Sex and the City? You know, and that's really big. And to have women doing that.
To have women talking to each other as well as
yes.
through their actions to the audience.
Yeah, to have women talking about sex to each other was just, I mean, because what they were doing is they made a show about sex, from a woman's perspective. And that was why I believe those early reviews were just losing their minds, because they didn't know what to do with this at all. Like, even the sex scenes, if you think about them, they weren't like sexy. They weren't like, ooh, this is almost porn, I'm so turned on.
Some of them were
they were
awkward.
funny.
Yeah, and some of them were awkward.
Funny, awkward, character revealing, but not really like the way that I think maybe a show that was from a male perspective would depict the same things. So
you alluded to this a little bit earlier, the idea that this being women's entertainment, you know, helped people trivialize it somewhat when it was on. And I wonder if it also didn't help some of it fly under the outrage radar to the point where, you know, if this were, you know, in another time, this could have been picketed and there would have been a much bigger outcry. But because it was a show for girls, you know, was there a little bit less scrutiny?
So I think probably yes, but I also think they did a lot of stuff that they now take a lot of heat for. I don't know. I'm not saying they sat down and they were like, had this diabolical plan to figure out how to do. I think they just instinctively made a lot of choices. And I think that the deeply apolitical viewpoint of the show helped. I mean, there's literally a time, it's so hard to, there's so many things that are hard to watch in 2018 on the show, and this is one of them, is like, when Carrie dates the politician played by John Slattery, there's a absolutely horrifying brunch discussion in which they discuss politics, the women, and they're all like, ha ha ha, Carrie's not even registered to vote. And that's just the beginning. Then the whole discussion is just about, like, Samantha has this thing about, like, you have to be hot to be president, but which is really not true. Then they talk about Nixon. It's just, like, dumb. It's the dumbest conversation you've ever heard. I think that plus all of it, honestly, like, the fashion is actually a huge part of it, but it also allows people to kind of trivialize it a little bit. And so it's like, you know, I have this idea that this show was kind of saying, like, we'll just be over here shopping, don't you worry. Yeah. You know, while we're taking over the patriarchy, heels. Anyway, there was I wish I could get this right. There was this meme that I saw that I thought was so on point about Sex and it wasn't supposed to be about Sex and the City, but it said something like, it started out saying something like, okay, so we're gonna all go shoe shopping, and then we're gonna do this, then we're gonna, like, have cupcakes, and okay, are they not listening anymore? Here's how we're gonna take over the patriarchy. And I feel like that was a huge part of what they were doing, is they couldn't push it too far in terms of actual political statements. So every time it seemed like it was getting close, they had to kind of, like, be like, no, it's fine, yay, shoes, anyway. You know, and I think that there were reasons for that.
Yeah. So you've written about shows with, shall we say, intense fan bases.
Yes.
And so how do you distinguish between The Thing and what it becomes once it's out in the world? So so is Carrie Bradshaw the same as all of the girls who want to be Carrie Bradshaw?
No. Is the short answer. I mean, maybe some of us here want to be Carrie Bradshaw, and maybe we're just like her, I don't know. But yeah, I think I know what you're saying. Like, I think it's possible that some of the fandom, Carrie Bradshaw would be like, ugh. I mean, granted, some of the fandom's also like, Carrie Bradshaw, ugh. She's kind of terrible in a lot of ways. But yeah, like, I mean, these were cynical, dark, twisty women to a large extent, right? They weren't, I mean, they liked shoes, but you can be both. You can be dark and complicated and flawed and also like shoes. Like, I don't see why those two would even, like, have a Venn diagram that interacted with each other, you know? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. But yeah, I think that the show was one thing, and then it became this caricature in culture. And so maybe both the fandom and the perception of it is different from what the show sort of intended, essentially. Yeah, it gets very complicated, especially, like, the more time goes on. I'm thinking very much of this bizarre essay that came out a few weeks ago.
Do tell us about
that essay. You know what I'm talking about.
I do
right?
know.
So there was this very strange essay a few weeks ago that was like, Sex and the City ruined my life. And it was, Julia Allison. Who, it's funny because, like, a lot of us knew in New York City, just, like, personally and from around, but she was one of the first internet celebrities of the early 2000s. And she did this sort of, like, tell-all piece a few weeks ago about how, like, she modeled her whole life at that time on Carrie Bradshaw, and it ruined everything for her. It didn't work out at all. It's so weird how going into debt to buy shoes and clothes and, you know, going out and drinking every night and, you know, all of those things didn't add up to, like, a meaningful life for her, it turned out. And it's just weird. It's a very strange piece because she's also telling us how she had some kind of spiritual enlightenment, like went to Bali or some crap. That's how we all get spiritually enlightened.
She ate and prayed and loved.
That's what it was. So weird. So she's super enlightened now, and that's how she's able to realize that Sex in the City ruined her life. Which I'm like, I feel like there's like a few more steps maybe we still need of enlightenment. I mean, I don't want to judge other people's journeys, but it was an odd thing, and what I liked about it though is that it is my perception that she's not the only one out there who feels this way. In the introduction to my book, I basically write the flip side of the same essay, which is that, like, the first line, spoiler alert, the first line is, I left my fiance for Sex in the City. So I was inspired by the show to live a different life. I just didn't buy Manolos because I looked at my bank account and I was like, hey, you can't have those.
You chose rent.
I lived in one of these classic New York apartments with the shower in the kitchen and a mouse like sort of permanently living there and the whole thing. And it was just such an odd experience for me to read this because I was like, that sucks that you did that. But, there is this weird, like they didn't make you. Like, Sarah Jessica Parker didn't come to your house and make you imitate Carrie Bradshaw. And one hopes, like, my joke online was like, yes, and I hope you look forward to my essay about how The Sopranos ruined my life by turning me into a murderous gangster who wears bowling shirts and lives in New Jersey. Like no one did that about The Sopranos. I don't know why I keep going to The Sopranos today, but no one did that about The Sopranos. No one tried to time travel and become an ad executive in the 1960s because of Mad Men. Like, don't do that. Like, just enjoy the show or take the parts you want. So to me, that's like the ultimate of what you're talking about with that question, that like, I feel like even Carrie, let's hope she's matured a little, even Carrie would be like, oh girl, don't do that. Even Carrie acknowledged she was in debt, you know?
And that in and of itself is a reflection of how we're unwilling to let female characters and women generally be complicated.
Yes. I mean, I like to joke about how terrible Carrie is because I do think, has anybody like rewatched and been like, oh, girl.
She's kind of the worst.
Yeah, and I mean, part of it too is like I was younger than they were when it started, and now when I rewatch, I'm older than they are, so I'm like, oh, honey, just stop that, please, just don't do that. But yeah, like there's this. You see different things in them as you go on. I always say we all start as Carries and we become Mirandas. Because I feel like I hope I'm a Miranda now. But I did feel like a Carrie at the time. And I was kind of a mess. So it all works out.
So what is it that makes a show worthy of, there are a lot of very popular shows and there are a lot of very well-reviewed shows, but what is it that makes a show sort of worthy of the in-depth treatment that you give to these shows like Seinfeld and Sex and the City?
I mean, my first huge practical question is always like, I literally just have to fill 300 pages. With all those words and all that history. Yeah. That's how I do it.
Too many.
Too much of that. But so at first I have to know kind of just instinctively, like there's enough to do here that there's, like you said, there's plenty of other shows where I'm like, I love that show, but, and then it has to be something like if time has passed, presumably we have to still want to talk about it. We have to, the biggest thing for me is like, did it actually have a genuine effect on actual real people's everyday lives? And that's a tough one. And this show, I don't think any show beats it for that. Because it just like, there's like a pre and a post Sex and the City world. Whether or not you know it, whether or not you watched the show, your life did change. Like, people talk about sex differently. Women, like, it made brunch happen. It made cupcakes happen. It made cosmopolitans happen. It made Manolos happen. So it had this huge, monetary impact as well, which, you can dismiss, but it's, the people at Manolo and the people at Magnolia Cupcakes aren't dismissing it. It's Magnolia is an extraordinary example because it was a 30-second scene of them eating cupcakes at Magnolia Bakery. And I mean, to this, I tell this whole, there's like an actual dramatic epic story about the cupcakes that I tell in the book. I won't get too deep into it. You'll have to just get the book for that part. There's a lot of drama behind the scenes at Magnolia during this time. And it involves the bus tour as well. And, you know, bus tours is an example of this too. It still fills every day in New York City. They still fill a bus tour. And Magnolia just announced that they're expanding still more internationally. And I talked to the guy who owns Magnolia now. He bought it, it was a neighborhood bakery. He bought it and franchised it. And he said the only reason he bought it was Sex and the City. Like, it wasn't like, that was part of it. Because I said to him, like, can we really attribute the cupcake trend to him? He was like, 1,000% yes. Like, there's no doubt about it. The only reason I knew I could scale it was because of Sex and the City. And he bought it from the original owners and franchised it across the world. And he even said to me something I didn't think about, which is he said, you know, we're expanding in Asia. They didn't have cupcakes. But, you know, at least us, like, we grew up with cupcakes. Whereas, like, in Asia, Sex and the City introduced cupcakes to them, and then they wanted them. So, you know, it had a huge economic impact, cultural impact, social impact. I talked to a lot of people throughout the book as well about like little tiny ways or big ways that it affected their lives. And it's all kinds of things. I mean, there's sex stuff in there. There's literally people who told me, like, I tried this because they were into it on Sex and the City, or this is, you know, this is how I changed the way I thought about it. My sister, who's here, told me a story about, and she's in there, about how she it really affected her career path, that she would watch Sex and the City, and at the time we didn't have a lot of like blogs and Instagrams and all of that having to do with fashion. And so she didn't care about the sex part. She was just trying to watch for the fashion because she said, like, all we had in Homer Glen, Illinois was Vogue and Sex and the City to tell us what was cool. And so she is now a costumer on Chicago Med. Applause. Hold for applause. Because, you know, partly inspired by that. And so, like, because Patricia Field was the costume designer on Sex and the City, and she's a genius. So, like, I'm sitting here wearing this ridiculous thing because of Patricia Field. So, and my nameplate necklace. So,
Objectively, yeah.
yes.
Yeah. So, Sex and the City created a lot of jobs.
Yeah. I mean, that would be a really interesting question, is to try to figure out exactly how many. I don't know if you really could. But bus tour, cupcakes, Cosmos, fashion, like, I do have a whole chapter in the book that is about the Sex and the City economy, because it's so extraordinary, the things that they made happen. I mean, Cosmos, that was just like some random, it could have been any drink. And it was like, Cosmo won the lottery, and then like for a while you couldn't get Cosmos because you'd look like a basic bitch who wanted it just because of Sex and the City.
Appletinis.
And I've noticed this weird trend among my friends recently. Maybe it's just that I was writing the book too, but I've seen a number of people kind of go like, I'm gonna get a Cosmo, is that okay? And I'm like, so now we're like ordering them semi-ironically, like knowingly, but we kind of want them, and people are like, but they're just really refreshing, I'm sorry. It's weird. It's been a weird whole evolution of that one,
But how many other shows can you point to that have had that kind of lasting fandom where, you know, 20 years later, people are still, I mean, there was this outpouring online among people who were too young to have watched it. I mean, I hope they didn't watch it when it was first out.
when they were like 2 or something.
When they were, yeah, you know. But, you know, there was still that outpouring of like, you know, let's celebrate this, even though, you know, let's rewatch. There are all these rewatches going on and watch parties still.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting because people always ask me, like, are young people catching on to it? And they are. And the way that they're doing, it's like a very specific way. It's like if you look at the websites for the youngs, like Bustle and Refinery 29 and stuff like that, they're very into like, let's just beat this thing to death in terms of like all of the problematic parts of it so that we can then feel good. You know, if we just
then
say,
we'll
like,
get to the shoes.
It's okay, it's kind of racist and heterosexist and all of these things, but then as long as we acknowledge that, we can still also then enjoy the good parts.
Was there a passage that you wanted to read from?
Do we have it
the book
up here?
Let me Can I borrow
Can
someone's
we
copy?
just have
There we go.
one?
Here
Thank
you go.
you. I haven't read, well, I sort of did. I read the introduction for my audiobook. So I'll read, we'll see how it goes. I've never really read it out loud to a crowd. So I'm gonna do the beginning since that's my personal story and we're in my hometown. So, all right. We'll see how far I get. I left my fiance for Sex and the City. At the time, in the early 2000s, I was in my late 20s. I didn't know who I was, and it showed. One day I was wearing a striped sweater and beige slacks, purchased from a mall near where I lived in suburban New Jersey, to work at my magazine job in nearby New York City. The next day, I was buying black spiky heels, a hot pink miniskirt, and a black t-shirt from a thrift store in the city's punk rock steeped East Village neighborhood, where I still live now. I even recall a 1-month hippie phase with faded jeans, fringed belts, and off-the-shoulder peasant shirts that I thought were particularly cool to wear to literary readings in dark downtown bars. Very Joan Didion. I lead with the clothes because Sex and the City demonstrated how much they can mean. They indicated for me that so much was wrong, but that something right wanted to emerge. I was trying on selves. I was searching for an identity beyond what my upbringing in the Chicago suburbs, as a child of a dad who went to an office every day, and a mom who stayed home with my younger brother and sister and me. Hi, guys. Presented as my ready-to-wear options: girlfriend, wife, or mother. I wanted a nameplate necklace like Carrie Bradshaw's and a distinct, authentic, messy identity to go with it. Sex and the City helped me find myself. I think I'm just gonna stop there. Because then we get into the show and all of that stuff. You can find out what happens if you buy the book. Thank you
so much for
guys. This
coming.
is really fun.